Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Undoctrinate Yourself. Today, I'm sitting down again with Dr. Jack Kruse, who needs no introduction on this podcast at this point. We've been chatting for like an hour before we started recording, so we're kind of just going to get back into it. We just left off talking about pectin in the eye of, well, in birds, but initially eutherian mammals, you said, right? And how that's allowing them to go extended periods of time without eating, essentially.
Well, basically, pectin in theropod dinosaurs, the corollary in eutherian mammals is the leptin melanocortin pathway. And that is the reason why when you did your podcast with your friend from Houston, and you kind of casually mentioned the leptin melanocortin pathway, people haven't really put together those two issues. The real reason those things are important, they fundamentally link to why those two animals got through the last extinction event. So they have mitochondrial capacity buried in certain places. Mammals have it because they blocked sunlight for long periods of time because they lived underground for 7, 8, 9 months. So they needed mitochondrial capacity to do that. Theropod dinosaurs did it because they disconnected from Earth to go find their food source. Now, both animals have mitochondrial capacity buried in different tissues. As you know, birds tend to have it buried in their wings, and they also tend to have melanin throughout their feather system, which is another interesting part. And it turns out mammals tend to have their mitochondria, depending on what mammal we're talking about, in different spots. But the original ones were like small little rodents. Most of their melanin was in their hair and their skin. So it opens up kind of an interesting can of worms to start to think about how come we don't think about this in the latest version of eutherian mammals, which is us. Is this somehow tied to when we introduce aberrant light frequencies, into our environments that we actually get sick? And I think you already know the answer to that. You now know that it's true. And I think you also you'd be the PhD scientist that wouldn't argue with me that light controls metabolism. Now, how that story is developed, that's a 65 million year story that is epic. And how it's really developed in us compared to, say, our nearest relatives, that is also a very interesting story. But I think when you take the best way to do science, especially new science, when you're trying to uncover like new things about us, you have to go from like thermodynamic givens that are axiomatic truths that nobody can argue with you about, and then say, okay, well, how does this happen? And we started to talk about that podcast that you did with the doc. And I told you one of the interesting things about UV light is that it has all these interesting effects that actually work in unison together. So if you really want to understand how this whole process works, start with UV light, keeping the leptin melanocortin pathway and the idea of the magnetic compass in the birds. You remember you learned about this probably from the Klitschko paper in the 70s. Everybody thought it was a bunch of bullshit. And then, of course, we get into the late 90s and early 2000s, and we find out that indeed there's a magnetic chemical compass in their eyes that uses cryptochromes and free radicals. And the mechanism that most people today believe, because of Jim Al-Khalili's book, Life on the Edge, is that it's a radical pair mechanism. I don't believe that. I believe it's a radical triad mechanism. I think there's 3 free radicals that do this. But basically, birds are able to read magnetic flux as they fly to navigate. And when you think about the pectin that we just talked about, you're like, okay, this begins to make sense that the birds are using the magnetic part of the electromagnetic wave, and then they're using the electric part to drive their metabolism to make sure they can fly, appropriate ways. And then you think about the systems, the ancient systems in us. We started talking about metabolism 3.8 billion years ago when there's only 2 domains of life, prokaryotes and archaea. What's the main difference between those 2 creatures and us as eukaryotes? It's actually not only the nucleus, because that's what everybody focuses on, but it's also that there's a tremendous amount of infolding of the membranes. So you have to ask yourself, okay, what does a membrane do 3.8 billion years ago? It's an electric membrane. In other words, it drives CO2 fixation from the environment. That is still seen today in the trees behind me. Okay. They do exactly the same thing. And they're fixating CO2 to convert gases into organics to simulate growth. Okay. That's like photosynthesis 101. Nobody can argue with that either. But it turns out we do exactly the same thing. And what I was telling Alexis is that the interesting part of what happens in our membranes as humans is that there's a mechanism there where it works. And it turns out the TCA cycle spins two different ways. Okay. And it spins counterclockwise and clockwise. And it turns out CO2 fixation creates water, and water is a big part of the story with us. It's not as big a part of the story with plants and foodstuffs. The reason why is plants consume those things with CO2 and sunlight and water to create foods. What do? We're actually reversing that process to create CO2 and water. So it should immediately get you to ask, okay, what's that water doing? And is there somehow a difference between the water that a plant uses, or water that a plant makes, and the tap water that we put on the plant and the water that we make? The answers to all those things are, yeah, there's differences there. These are differences that no one in biology is really looking at. People in biophysics are looking at it. And then the real big idea, I think, is where Alexis is. She's the expert from her Rabinowitz lab time at Princeton. One of the things that we all get taught, we all become experts of biochemistry in our training, whether we're an MD or a PhD. But the interesting thing is the way in which we look at it, the perspective in which we look at it is radically different. And I remember one of the things that when I learned in, I believe it was 1986, from a PhD named Peter Setlow, he told me that all metabolism functions spontaneously. And I looked at him when he said it, like incredulous. I said, I've never heard that before. Like when I was in, grade school or in high school, even when I took the AP class and I smoked them. And he said, yeah, it's absolutely true. And then what happens inside a cell, metabolic flux changes, and we don't know why it changes, but we think the reason has to do a lot with enzymes. Well, that's kind of where my knowledge stayed for a long time until I started to jump down this rabbit hole. And then I found out something very interesting. I found out that the network topology of metabolism is older than genes. And when did I find that out? Found that out when Craig Ventnor was doing his work on the Human Genome Project, and the false belief that was present in the literature at the time that humans would have 100,000 genes and chimps and gorillas would have, 23,400, like they were known to have, in 92 through 96. And lo and behold, when the Human Genome Project comes out with the number during the Clinton administration, almost exactly the same. And then something else came out, that they found out that metabolism actually is older than our genome. That's when it got really interesting to me. Then I began to realize that many of the things that I was told from a Darwinian perspective could not be true. And, then I crashed into the work of Nick Lane, when he wrote Oxygen and Power, Sex, and Suicide, another PhD from University College London. And the idea throughout all his books, all the crazy things that I read in his books, brought me to read some very unusual things in biology that were in his bibliographies. And I went down some kind of weird rabbit holes. And I found out that genes amplify metabolic networks. In other words, the real purpose of genes isn't what the neo-Darwinists told us. Genes actually amplify metabolic flux. In other words, it's not enzymes that do it. It's actually the genes that change it. Then I found out something even crazier. I found out that things in physical chemistry can change it. I found out that the circadian clock genes can do it. Then I found out that ROS and RNS signals, chemical signals that have unpaired electrons, also can change how things work. And then I got really intrigued. And when you begin to see this, the next question that came up, I believe in my own mind, if I accept that electric membranes fixate gases and create organics, metabolism is spontaneous, and genes amplify the metabolic network, how's this system get any feedback? And then it dawned on me, electric membranes give feedback on the environment. And then I realized right then and there, I needed to look at the integument and the eye of mammals to figure out what the hell was going on in us. And lo and behold, what did I find? I found that our skin is the largest organ in our body, and it's loaded with non-visual photoreceptors. Our eye is loaded with visual photoreceptors. So I studied the visual ones. Why? Because I'm a brain surgeon, and those are the ones I knew the best. And I went and found out that there was a new non-visual photoreceptor in the eye found in 2009, and that was melanopsin. Then I found out about another opsin in the cornea and the skin called neuropsin. And I found out about another one that's in the brain, the cornea, and the skin called encephalopsin. And then I started to put this all together. I'm like, how many of these freaking opsins are there, and what the hell are they doing? And then I started to think about the skin away from the eye. I said, what's the non-visual photoreceptors in the skin? And this is where I kind of hit a roadblock. And the roadblock was solved when I actually looked at the phospholipids in the skin that were most common. It turned out there's two: cholesterol and the phospholipids. And I started to read a lot about DHA, cholesterol, and everything else. And I found out that cholesterol has a very unique spectral distribution with light that changes over time, depending on whether it's HDL or LDL. And I looked for the reason, and I found out it's the number of electrons in cholesterol. Then I started to look at some papers in the late 90s about DHA, because that's another thing that's in all of the membranes in mammals, with the exception of one, which is the inner mitochondrial membrane, which has a bacterial lineage, because bacteria basically is, mitochondria is a stolen mutant from archaean bacteria. And I realized that DHA was a big part of the story that acted like an electric cable photoelectrically to work with light. And then I found out there was more DHA in the central retinal pathways than there was in the skin. And then I said, okay, I need to start to think about the skin differently. So if cholesterol is a non-visual photoreceptor, what else is? Then I found out folic acid was. Then I found out B12 was. Then I found out the big one, what's right below the skin. Turns out it's the circulatory system, the arterioles in there. What's the number one porphyrin that's present in our body that mimics, chlorophyll?
Hemoglobin.
Hemoglobin, you got it. And what's the difference there? The center atom
Magnesium.
is magnesium for iron. It's got 12 more electrons. I'm like, bro, this has got to be photoelectric. It's got to be a photoelectric story. So started putting all this stuff together, and I began to realize when further papers came out in 2014 that melanopsin now not just was in the skin, it's also in the fat, it's in the arteries. Then I got even crazier information. It's the number one opsin in the human brain. And then I go, okay, now I'm beginning to understand why chimps, when they're born, have no frontal lobes. They're skinny. They're born almost fully functioning with their brain. They have no subcu fat, but yet mammals, who are supposed to be nearest to them, only have maybe 200 genes different. And they have their fat little goos that are born with immature brains, and they have tons of fat under their skin. And that's where they hide their leptin, right below the skin. I started seeing all these parts. And I said, there's absolutely no way that biochemistry controls all this. There is no earthly idea that makes sense that leptin would go from subcutaneous fat into the hypothalamus to tell about energy transmission. And you did the podcast with your friend. You even mentioned it was the Friedman lab in 94 that figured this out. But it's the queerest thing ever to say, how is this main energy hormone located in sub-Q fat and somehow linked to the brain that links to, when we should eat, how much should we eat, and how does it all work? And, like I told you, at the foot of Michelangelo's David, when I looked up at perfection and looked down at my fat ass, I realized the answer. It was fucking light. It was actually sunlight specifically. And the crazy thing is there's a little bird sitting right there on the ledge when it happened. And that's when it hit me right away. Oh shit. We've got melanin in our RPE and they have melanin in their eye. And we have melanin in our integument. I'm like, bro, this is a light story. So I went down that rabbit hole. Then I realized that the non-visual and visual photoreceptors in the eye and the brain and everywhere else in your body are all connected. And they're connected by light. And then that's when I jumped down the biophysics. That's when I read the onion root experiment. That's when I read the radish experiment. That's when I found out that you can't get past mitosis in the cell cycle unless you make biophotons. And I'm going, how, you mean we make biophotons? And I said, yeah, it's pretty simple. I didn't believe it to begin with until one of my friends had a thermal camera that he used for his AC, and we used it on each other, and we were able to see light that we couldn't see. And I was like, holy shit, we really do have light inside us. Then I thought, could we make different light? And it turns out we can. We can make it from metabolism. But it turns out when we make that light, we have to have oxygen and ROS and RNS to do it. In other words, the transformation of chemical biologic energy to create photonic electronic energy has a recipe. And it turns out that recipe was buried in the original experiments, from Gurwitch and the radish root experiments that the Russians did. And then it was actually buried in Roland Van Wyck's book. And then I began to realize that light spectra control metabolism. Each metabolic pathway does different things. And then immediately I started to realize this is the reason why beta oxidation with a 16 carbon chain makes 147 ATP. And when you eat glucose, you make 36. Then I thought about all the isoforms of nitric oxide everywhere in the body. And I said, isn't it funny that muscle has 3? And then I thought about, well, that's gluconeogenesis, the PPP, glucose, and beta oxidation. Could that be the reason why this happens? And I started thinking about all the free radicals. People forget nitric oxide is one of the free radicals. It's an RNS. We got a Nobel Prize in 1992 for this. What's the most magical part of nitric oxide, Alexis? Tell the audience.
It tunes down ATP production at the level of mitochondria.
So it destroys energy production when we're in the sun. What's the other magical thing about it, Alexis? Does it act globally or focally?
It acts locally.
So guess what? That means where the light hits you is the only place it acts. Okay? So maybe you're beginning to realize now why men need to take Viagra, because their junk is never in the sun, so they never vasodilate parts of their bodies because it's devoid of nitric oxide. Could that be the same reason why blood pressure is a problem for most people? Yeah, because they wear sunscreen and they wear clothes when they go outside and they think, oh, because I'm outside, I'm exposing everything to. So I started to look at all my patients and made them take all their makeup and sunglasses and contacts out and all their clothes off and put them in a gown and said, I'm going to look at your body. And everybody looked at me like I was crazy. But guess what? Then I started to look for evidence where they were really pale compared to other parts of their body. And I started to look in their arteries and those levels. I started to do nitric oxide tests in those levels. And guess what I found? next to non-existent. Any place that had no nitric oxide also had peripheral artery disease. In other words, the intima was thicker than it should be. And I thought to myself, I wonder if this is what causes heart disease. And guess what? It is. And it turns out the more you age, the less nitric oxide you make, unless you do what, Alexis? Go
Out in
out
the sun,
and get
naked.
naked. Then I thought about something even crazier about nitric oxide. I said, during the day, this is telling me we're not designed to eat because nitric oxide is created and it turns off your mitochondrial production of ATP. And everybody learns in medical school that you can't live without ATP, right? And I did a hard stop. I said, what else does fucking UV light make? I said, oh,
C,
POMC and what else?
alpha, beta, and gamma MSH.
And I'm like, that's the reason why we don't eat, because guess what? Alpha, beta, and gamma MSH turn off satiety, or they stimulate satiety, turn off appetite, and they calorie restrict us naturally. Then I realized that the UV, I should say the VDR receptor was also on the intermitochondrial membrane. So that told me that not only is nitric oxide working at cytochrome C oxidase to turn it off, that the VDR receptor is actually turning off electron chain transport proximal to cytochrome C oxidase. In other words, the body, when it's in the sun, clamps down huge on making ATP. That kind of told me that ATP production during the day when electric fields dominate in the sun is not something we should strive for. Told me something else was critical. Turned out that criticality was grounding and the effect of water in our blood and made from our mitochondria. Why? Because what's the major chromophore we haven't talked about? That's not UV yet.
Water.
You got it. Turns out that's really what drives most of our biochemistry during the day. It's infrared A and near infrared light. And it turns out that makes total sense. Why? What's the most dominant part of sunlight?
Infrared.
Starting to all make sense, doesn't it?
And that's also why in the leptin reset, you say to eat within 30 minutes of waking up, basically before the UV comes into the picture.
Boom. Girlfriend, you're making me really happy because you're starting to see the loose ends. And then, the other thing that I think is important, when people begin to see how the UV and the infrared truly work in your mitochondria, then you start going, this effect is generalized all over our body. Different tissues have different requirements. And then it begins to make sense to you why the eye does things differently than the liver and why the liver does things differently than the kidney. And then you start asking yourself questions. Well, are the isoforms of all these free radical signals the same or different in different tissues we're looking at? And when you find out what I've already found out, that they are different, then you begin to find out not only do genes amplify the metabolic network, it turns out free radicals really do it. Okay. Then you start to find out so that some of the most, what the most powerful, I shouldn't say powerful. Do you know what the fastest enzyme is in the human body?
Oh, is it in glycolysis?
Catalase.
Oh, it's catalase. Okay.
And think about why that would make sense. Because when you're controlling metabolism with light, you need to have a heme-based, I guess you want to call it a non-visual photoreceptor in your blood to quench all these reactions. And it turns out that's what catalase is. Most people don't know that catalase is a heme-based photoreceptor. It also works with peroxidases. So when you're in third grade, and you remember you put hydrogen peroxide and a piece of liver together, it basically creates a bomb in a Coca-Cola bottle. Well, that's exactly what it's doing in you. And it turns out that's the reason why white blood cells are loaded with catalase and ROS and melanin, because guess what's happening there? You need that superoxide burst to kill foreign invaders. And when you get autoimmune conditions, guess what that means? That you likely don't have any catalase or you don't have any melanin in your T cells to drive it. Alexis, I'm going to ask you one more question.
Okay.
In the skin, I already gave you the answer. I was going to say, In the body, where do we have the most T cells?
Oh, it's
In
the
the
skin.
skin.
Okay.
So guess what? Now I want you to do a hard stop and go, so is this the real reason why autoimmunity is a huge
Oh.
problem for humans?
Well,
Because
if you're developing melanin in your skin, can those melanocytes or melanosomes contribute to melanin in the T cells?
yeah, they can, but guess what? You need to still have the melanin in the T cell. Where does the T cell come from? Comes from the thymus, doesn't it?
Thymus. Yeah.
From the bone marrow.
Yeah.
So what does that tell you? In other words, that's another effect tied to what? The vitamin D story. You need to have that UV light stored at the electronic and vibrational level to inform the T cells and the B cells to stimulate melanin. Now, here's the interesting thing. Since the thymus and the bone marrow is in the middle of the bones, and we know that no UV light's getting through there, wouldn't it stand to reason that if you look at the thermodynamic givens, I know the sun doesn't get there, and I know surface things knock UV light away. So what do you think the young, dumb Jack Kruse asked himself?
Are they
Could
making
we?
their own?
You got it. And it turns out we do. And it turns out we use deuterium in our blood to actually start that process. That's the reason why deuterium in our blood is a good thing. But it's also a reason why deuterium in the mitochondria is not. Why? Because when you squeeze deuterium, you create UVA, UVB, UVC, and VUV light. Do you think it would be a good idea to create that much light in the mitochondria from metabolism?
No.
And that's the reason why when you put deuterium in the matrix and you make too much light, what are you doing? You're stimulating huge amounts of mitosis. What's that disease called, Alexis?
Cancer?
You got it. We are designed, since we are eukaryotes, to do exactly the opposite of what prokaryotes do. Remember when we started this story in the beginning? Prokaryotes release 5,000 times more light than we do. What do? We reserve all our light. Why? Because we're using the light to control all of our biochemistry. And our biochemistry requires quantum precision. And it uses all these little steps in there. Turns out the magnetochemistry is more important when it's dark. The electrochemistry is more important during the light. But how it really works is a big deal. So when you filter this thought experiment that I'm taking you through, you're a smart person trained at the Rabinowitz lab. When Jack Kruse says to you now that food is not as important as everything else, do you understand yet why Jack Kruse says what he says?
Yeah. I mean, because
Because
food is light anyways, right? So it's not like
it
it's,
is, but what did we just go through? The walk that we just went through on your intermitochondrial membrane. UV light turns down
yes.
electron chain transport. And in your last podcast with Dr. Gabrielle, you correctly pointed out to her, even though she couldn't believe it, that all foods are broken down to hydrogen, protons, and electrons. Well, do you need those electrons if UV light is turning down electron chain transport?
No.
Oh, you don't.
So where do the electrons go that you get from grounding and from melanin splitting water?
It's going to go into the liver. And guess what the liver is going to do? You have different isoenzymes there, right? That's actually how you create visceral fat. And what you first do is you send all that fat, okay, this process goes to your subcutaneous fat first. Why? This is evolutionary atavism. Remember how I told you came into the world as a baby with a immature brain. So why doesn't it go to your brain and get metabolized by all those things up there? Because your brain is already fully formed, or mostly fully formed by the time you're 25, 28. So what does the body do? The liver takes that excess electrons, the excess protons, and actually packages them in other, electric membranes, and then puts it where it used to be when you were a baby for storekeeping later. And the hormones that control that fat mass accumulation are leptin and adiponectin. Leptin is the filling up the tank. Adiponectin is emptying the tank. And what is paying attention to that? It's actually all the places where we bury our mitochondrial capacity. So in us, that's the
The heart
heart,
and the brain.
brain, the bone, the immune system. Those are the top four. So I want you to think about that. Why all these diseases now are functionally linked with light. Now you know the reason why.
Do you think the fascial or the collagen networks are what transfers those electrons from your surfaces
We
into?
know that. We know
Yeah.
that from Becker's work.
Yeah.
Remember, Becker told us that not only is bone piezoelectric, it's flexoelectric and pyroelectric. So is everything in fascia. In fact, I'm even going to tell you the microtubule network in you works that way. And that's part of the reason why, we talked earlier about before we started the podcast about how ultrasound can liberate nitric oxide. Now you're probably realizing that just massage can do the same thing. And this is the reason why acupuncture also works, because what are you doing? You're putting an alloy into basically an electric membrane structure. So what does that do? It generates an electrostatic charge. That electrostatic charge changes metabolism in that dermatomal band or in the fascial band that is controlled below that level. Those tissues all work different ways. Not only is it a neurologic dermatomal arrangement, but it's also a fascial band arrangement. And if you think about the fascial bands that are in and around the body, the one that I deal with the most is the one that connects the occipitalis and the frontalis muscle. Well, if you rub anybody, like you have any good friends that you like, and you give them a scalp massage, the reason why you like it so much is actually you're delivering and moving electric charge to the occiput and to the frontal bones. Okay. And you actually can stimulate thinking, relaxation from doing that. Why? Because this area up here is all controlled by the trigeminal nerve. It's actually one of the ways that I teach people that they can treat central sleep apnea. Freaks people out when I tell them that.
Wow. What causes central sleep apnea? It's a hypothalamic issue?
Hypermethylation of the brainstem. Generally from the mechanism I just told you. What did I tell you we make endogenous light from? ROS and oxygen. So what is the body telling you when you're sleep apneic and you're hypoxic? You already got enough. You don't need any more. We need you to rebalance the system, because it turns out oxygen can be toxic even to humans. I got into some fights with some of my ex-members. I had to boot them from my website. And I explained to them, I said, if you don't think oxygen can be toxic, you forgot what happened to the astronauts in 1971 when they burned up, getting ready to go. I should say it was in 67 before they went to the moon. And then the other thing you forget is you probably never talked to a doctor about the disease called ARDS, which is acute respiratory distress syndrome. It's also the same syndrome that develops before you have multi-organ system failure that we see in sepsis or we see in COVID. And what happens? It's a loss of electron membrane potential everywhere. So that means you can't do fixation. And this is effectively what happened in COVID. This is the reason why people clotted. This is the reason why there's fibrinous clots inside their lungs, because you had this failure. And it turns out oxygen can be toxic to us.
Is
This
that
is
related to the zeta potential at all?
absolutely.
Yeah.
And you have to realize the zeta potential is good for a variety of different reasons, because the blood is truly electromagnetic. And if you follow my work, you read my Patreon blogs, especially the early ones, I have pictures in there that tell you that the blood is a non-Newtonian magneto-hydrodynamic fluid. I mean, I know that's a lot to say, but what did I basically just tell you there? That your red blood cell is a radio antenna that connects the sun to your mitochondria, and it does it photoelectrically and magnetically. And it can't be based on Newtonian physics. Why? Because Newtonian physics only deals with absolute time. Let me ask you a question, Alexis. How long does it take from a red blood cell to get to your heart, deoxygenated, to be oxygenated up to your brain or into your coronary arteries?
Pretty fast. I don't know.
8 to 13 seconds.
Yeah.
So right then and there, that tells you exactly the reason why timing matters. This is the reason why timing is a big issue, because everything comes to your tissues, not in absolute time. It's relative. And what's the first organ that gets the newly oxygenated blood? The heart. That's why the coronary arteries come right off the aorta. What's the next one? The brain, because you got the carotids and the vertebral systems coming off the aorta and the subclavians. Well, what's the other interesting thing? The brain gets 20% of the cardiac output. The heart only gets very little. So what does that tell you? It tells you the metabolism between the heart and the brain has to be radically different metabolically, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that that may have something to do with the metabolism we use? We know that the heart likes beta oxidation, right? It likes ATP. What did I tell you before we started this? The belief that you and I both learned in school was that the brain likes glucose.
Yeah.
Is that true anymore, Alexis?
Yeah, I mean, well, you said lactate, and actually, I did experiments when I was in Josh's lab looking at brain substrate utilization and well, in ketogenic diet, fasting, and also high carbohydrate diets, and we showed that in the low carb state, lactate consumption went up a lot in the brain. There was still a contribution from glucose directly. We used some differential equations to basically try to parse
Can
out
I
the
tell you
difference
why?
between.
Should I solve for X for you now?
Yeah,
What is
because
what
yeah,
is the radical? What is the radical that controls that?
that controls lactate usage.
Yeah, from vitamins, I should say from glucose to lactate. It's vitamin C
Okay.
in the glial cell. The glial cell actually releases it and it changes metabolism.
What do
That's
you
how
think?
it is.
What do you think about
Just remember what I'm saying to you. Another free radical changes the mix. People forget that vitamin C can be in a scorebook
yeah.
radical. And
What,
guess what? That's what it does. And what else should you know about vitamin C? Do you know that vitamin C is a cofactor in melanin production, dopamine production, neuroepinephrine production? You think might this have anything to do with all the crazy stuff that I said to Huberman and Rick in that podcast?
well, how does that tie in with the fact that like the human species is one of the only ones that doesn't make its own vitamin C from glucose?
Think about it. You tell me. I'm going to tell you the answer is in my current blogs.
Okay. I'll have to dive in there.
And I will also tell you that the interesting part of this is we reserve this for different tissues that use different metabolic pathways. And it turns out anything that has melanin in it usually has a lot of vitamin C in it. So think about the neurocrest derivatives. You can imagine the amount of vitamin C that must be around the adrenal medulla is off the chain.
Yep.
Same thing is true in the substantia nigra. Same thing is true in the RPE. I want you to think about even collagen. Everybody knows the link between vitamin C and collagen, you know, that it loses its piezoelectricity and you get bleeding and things like that. Think about what happens in your blood. All the manifestation of scurvy. Basically, what you're doing, you're losing your electrical potential. Why is that? Because you're destroying melanin. You're losing the ability to create more melanin. You can't keep the melanin that you make. Even if you're on a boat in the ocean and you're in UV light, if you don't have a little bit of vitamin C, you still make it. You're not a guinea pig. Guinea pigs can make it all the time. You have to have it exogenously. Why might that be? I want you to think about this long and hard. Could it be that our nearest relatives that have the same number of genes as us, we didn't need it anymore because we lost the melanin on our skin and they kept eating citrus fruits? And all of a sudden we didn't need to have it anymore. Why? Because we changed the leptin melanocortin pathway in us and sculpted our biology using that light. The reason the genes are almost the same is we use light to sculpt us. We didn't use genes to do it. Remember what I told you about genes? Genes amplify metabolic networks. So I'm telling you that the POMC gene is what created humans. And it's also the reason why we don't rely on endogenous vitamin C production. We don't need very much of it to work, but it's critical in driving the metabolic networks that work with melanin. And this is the reason why when you destroy melanin, say from using sunscreen or sunglasses, you see such dramatic effects. It's the reason why you see anybody who's got pale skin, they never have their mammal hair. Look at people's uneven faces. Like every woman who's going to listen to this podcast, why don't you take all your makeup off and go look in the mirror? But just don't put an LED light on. Turns out the act of you putting your makeup on actually caused a lot of that problem. In fact, I will tell you a lot of sleep apnea is caused by using blue LED light in your face. What do we stare in front of every day? Alexis, for the
Screens,
last 30, 40 years?
screens,
Yeah,
TVs.
what did the dermatologist tell you? Yeah, you get melasma on your face from what? The sun, right? But not blue light. They don't tell you the truth because they know if they block the sun that you keep coming in and you become a really good patient. But women forget that now most of their makeup, their foundation blocks UVA and UVB light. It's effectively sunscreen.
Yeah. And it blocks some blue light too, right?
Absolutely. And guess what else it does? Could that cause pregnenolone-Steele syndrome? Let me ask you another question. What makes all your sex steroid hormones?
Pregnenolone.
And where is that made? Predominantly in your head and neck,
Uh,
pituitary
pituitary
glands,
gland. Yeah.
right? Right behind your eyes. You think staring into those screens or living around that may have any role there? Like, could that be the reason why everybody's infertile? Everybody's got endometriosis. Everybody's got period problems. Oh, when I bleed, I'm a bitch. Oh, when I bleed, I'm miserable. Oh, the tracks there that connect your trigeminal, where do they go? They go to the limbic system. You want to hear another interesting thing that I've only told one other podcaster, and his podcast hasn't gone live yet. Have you ever thought about the link between the olfactory or um, the limbic system and the visual system? You know that that's two different layer cortex, right? One's
Okay.
got 3 layers, the other one's got 6. What does that mean for oxygen? More or less. What does it mean for mitochondria? Which one's older? Which one's younger? You want to know the reason why when humans go out, they sneeze sometimes when they see bright light? That's the reason why. How you like that?
Wow.
All the things that you haven't thought about, all tied to light. And it's tied to the ROS and RNS burst you make. In other words, it's not just a story of frequency, is it? You're beginning to see something that you didn't see before. Then the other part of the story that I did tell Rick and Huberman, but I didn't really amplify it, but I'm going to amplify it here because of the story that I'm laying out with you. Remember that melanin also absorbs ROS and RNS. So if you don't have melanin in those tissues, can you run magnetochemical processing in you properly? The answer is you cannot. And this is one of the other reasons why all the diseases that are tied to blue light also tend to have peripheral artery disease associated with them. And it's also the reason why melanin loss occurs not only on the outside first, but eventually shows up on the inside. That's effectively what Parkinson's disease is. And this is also the reason why in my blogs that I've told people that people with Parkinson's disease have a much higher rate of hypothyroidism and melanoma. Why? Have no melanin in those areas. All these things are linked. The problem is the discussion you and I are having right now is like the end of Da Vinci Code. I know Jack's right about this, but I didn't see how all this fits together. And when you see it for the first time, and you actually think about what you and I are talking about, then you'll see why when I watched that podcast with you and your friend, I said, me and Alexis need to talk pretty soon.
I felt
I
that
thought
way too.
I felt you did a spectacular job there, but I think she needs to go back and watch that one again that you did with her, and then she needs to watch this one. So let me tell you something, girlfriend. There's a lot of fat on the bone, a lot. And it's really, really important that we understand and we teach people how light controls everything and in ways that you can't even fathom yet. Like I said, I I talked. There's a couple of threads on my forum. You really want to get into it. One is in, I think, the Ask Jack part. It's called Decentralized Science. It's written with another PhD researcher. She's new to me. She's trying to help her son get better, who's in a pretty bad way. Go read that thread and everything that you and I talked, and you'll sit there and you'll just be spellbound. You basically just showed her how this kid's frontal lobes are falling apart. And it all started with the Apple devices that she gave him. Digital babysitting. And you remember, she's very apparently, from what I found out, pretty famous PhD researcher. And I told her, you want to fix your kid, you got to take a sabbatical, unplug and get him to the tropics. Because there's nothing in this kid's frontal lobes that's working electrically or magnetochemically. And that's the reason why he's got the problem he's got. But all the chemistry that you and I just talked about today, it's all there. And you're going to see it in a different way. Then you're going to see when I start talking about the gut. The gut works exactly the same way, except the gut has filled with microbiome that releases how much light? Tons of it. And we're designed to sample that. There's total communication between the enterocytes. Where's the second most T cells in your body?
The gut-associated lymphoid tissue.
You got it.
Yeah.
And that's why you hear all these idiot functional medicine doctors telling you that autoimmunity begins in the gut. No, they don't even know there's more T cells in the skin. And it turns out the skin clocks control the gut clocks. How do you like that? So if
Yep.
the skin is bad, you know by definition the gut's bad. So anybody who has SIBO, anybody who has mold, you all have huge problems with your electric membranes on the surface and deep inside. You need
Yep.
more, not less.
Well, that's what I think about a lot too. All the surfaces being linked, the lungs, the skin, all the mucous membranes, the gut, they're all reciprocal in some way. I think we're only just, like in centralized science, at least, only just beginning to scratch the surface there. But when we think about the coordinated functions across the different barrier tissues, it just makes a lot of sense.
All right, well, think about this then, because I'm glad you said that. Try this one on for size. For light to have its full effect, full biologic effect, photons must be absorbed by the visual and non-visual photoreceptors in the living body, in the living state. If one or both are missing, there is no proper physiologic effect. In fact, you may get an aberrant effect. It turns out ROS, RNS is created in the mitochondria, but there's 11 other places that it's also created within a cell. And any leftover oxygen, from metabolism in that tissue actually begins the timing process for metabolism. So I think most people know, like in mitochondria, human mitochondria, that's where superoxide, hydrogen peroxide, the hydroxyl free radical, those are all made. We already talked about nitric oxide, but there's also peroxynitrate that's made. And then there's some other ones, like hydrogen sulfide gas is another free radical in us. But it's tend to be made more in the gut. That also has to do with timing. But you have to realize that the free radical state in you is kept in check by melanin. In other words, magnetochemistry is almost completely controlled by melanin. That's the reason why melanin is so incredibly important to humans and not important to a lot of other mammals. We really rely on it. And this is the reason why melanin, vitamin D, and nitric oxide are all made from the same band, the purple band of light in the sun. And even though it's the least frequent, it's probably one of the most important because it's what created us to be human. So if you're a religious person listening to this is the part of the podcast where you go open the Bible up and see what Genesis 1:1 to 1:15 says. It says, let there be light. Well, guess what? This podcast I'm doing, Alexis, is telling you the recipe. See, God never told you the recipe. I believe I was put on this earth to figure out the recipe. And the reason I jumped down this rabbit hole was because of my own problem. I wanted to figure out really what was going on. If you thought that I ever thought that this was going to go through non-visual and visual photoreceptors, you're absolutely crazy. I never thought, that it would ever go through here. And all the places that it's taken me and all the different things. Now I'm completely amused by picking all these things up and putting all these pieces together, because believe it or not, when you truly understand what I've told you in this podcast, understanding biochemistry, understanding physical chemistry, understanding organic chemistry, understanding really phenotype, haplotype, mitochondrial medicine, how nuclear genes work, actually everything becomes much easier. It begins to make sense. The problem is you start to realize that you have to start subtracting out like the central theorem of biology. you have to start subtracting out all the things that you learned in biochemistry because they're not important. And the reason I decided to discuss some of this with you, because unlike Huberman, you are a PhD that actually did get intrigued. You did open your mind. He's gone completely the opposite way. And the funny thing is, it may turn out probably to be better that it's you than him. Why? Because you're plugged in with all the metabolic food guru creators in that Princeton lab. He's really not. He's really not terribly connected anymore at all with anybody, except, creating money for Stanford University through the podcast. I mean, that's all well and good, but I want people to understand. I've told people this for 20 years on my site. I said, when I'm done or dead and buried, I said axiomatically, when I'm finished, that it will be shown that what happens on the surface of organs is more important than what happens deep inside. And that sounds totally crazy to people who believe in biochemistry. And I think when you hear what I told you here today, when you hear about the conversation that we had before we hit the record button, you go, shit, there's a whole layer to this that it's just not frequency. It's a lot of different things. And that's what makes light so incredible. It's the most incredible part of life. I'm not trying to tell you that magnetism and water aren't important, because they are. But that's probably a story for another day. But I just gave you a little insight to the wiring diagram of really what's going on in the mitochondria. And when you see how it really works and you see how it connects with the brain, then you begin to look at tissues and go, okay, now I know why the human retina uses a Warburg metabolism and why it's not a good idea to use it in different organs. This begins to make some sense. So in other words, Warburg metabolism isn't pathologic like Thomas Siegfried wants to tell people, where he tells people cancer is a metabolic disease. I agree with him on that. But the Warburg metabolism is not something that you should throw under the bus. You need to understand that it has a specific physiologic context. And when you find out that tissues that don't like proliferation use it, that's the reason why the retina uses it. Goes back to the story that I told you about the pectin in the bird's eyes. What's the difference between birds and us? You look in an eye, you look at a retina, our ophthalmic artery goes all over our retina. What's the one place that it's not? In our fovea. That's where our central vision is, isn't it? So what is nature or God telling us? You can't put blood vessels where you see. You put it where the non-visual photoreceptors are. That's where melanopsin is. And it turns out that's the reason why peripheral retinopathy, or the retinopathy of diabetes, where is it located? All on the outside. Whereas blue light toxicity on the retina? All on the outside. What's the metabolism of the fovea? Completely done Warburg metabolism. What's the key in Warburg metabolism? You got to know the magics of what water's doing. Water explains the Warburg metabolism. That's the reason why glucose is a quencher of some of these free radical signals. Why? Glucose can get rid of the highly proliferative magnetochemical signals that are there that actually wind up causing oncogenesis. That's the reason why it happens.
There's a lot to unpack there, and I'm gonna have to listen back to fully get it. But I wanted to make sure that I ask a question about surfaces, because when we're talking about the importance of surfaces in regulating deeper parts of biology, we're basically one of the only hairless mammals, which in my view would then imply that we need more sun, right? Because why else would we lose our hair?
See, you're making me happy. You're beginning to realize we are the one primate that needs more sun, not less. And it turns out the younger we are, we need it, more sun, to get rid of the sub-Q fat to myelinate the brain. When we get older, we need it for a different reason. We need it to run all of our biology, get the longevity we need. That's the reason why. And it turns out When you don't, what do? You revert the atavistic effect. What is obesity? You're putting fat back into the subcutaneous system, and then eventually it spills over into the visceral system because everything is light mismatched. And then what diseases you get? You get the same diseases. What is autism? You're reverting back to a chimp. You can't talk. Sensation doesn't make sense. Think about diabetes. You're losing your hair, right? You lose your sight. You pee a lot. You're getting rid of a lot of your water. That all the symptoms of this begin to make sense. And the disease, like I was thinking of when I was talking to you about the chimps, people who don't get a lot of sunlight, live further from the equator, don't they get a disease called MS? Don't they get more ALS? All of a sudden you start going, holy shit. This makes sense because what's happening? Myelin's breaking down. And what do most MS patients have in common? They also start to gain more weight. They're metabolically unfit. Well, it turns out the reason why now, because they don't have any UV light that's driving that process on the inner mitochondrial membrane, slowing electron chain transport down, controlling the ROS signal at cytochrome 1, cytochrome 2, and cytochrome 3. You begin to see it all, and you go, this makes total sense. It's a light-driven process, and you will never understand chronic diseases until you understand the light. I can tell you, if biochemistry would have explained it to you, y'all would have figured this out a long time ago. Why? Because biochemistry has been a 100-year story. Quantum biology is also a 100-year story, but nobody in biochemistry learns anything about light. You know that. And people don't realize, if you were really to think about this, and I probably can say this to you, I probably can't say it to most people that interview me. The way I look at this whole story is I look at pyruvate and lactate like in a division equation, NAD positive and NADH in the same equation. They equal each other. And it turns out the pH is the next division because it's telling you about the positive and negative charge. And in health, you have a huge negative charge. In disease, you have a huge positive charge because of the protons. And when you actually think about this, you go, Jesus, everything about this story is electromagnetic. It's quantum mechanical. It's electrons and protons at its core. And really, our substrates are basically electron carriers or proton carriers or both. And that's effectively what NAD positive is. It's an electron and proton carrier. That's exactly what it does. And we don't think about it like that. And we need to. We need to get people to really begin to see, this whole thing. And then I always like to tell doctors, the functional medicine doctors, that people who have diabetes, they don't make a proper superoxide pulse at cytochrome 1. That should be a clue to you. And the reason why is their blood glucose is high. Remember I told you before that glucose quenches, ROS? Look, it's all there. It's all that when you actually put it together, and I agree with what you said, Jack, it's going to take me a while to digest this, but you are the perfect person to digest it. I couldn't have this talk with anybody else, but I knew after your talk with the good doctor, I said, oh yeah, me and Alexis need to sit down and have a little chat. I can give you plenty to chew on with her. And I guess maybe where we'll end this one, I want you to think about the two division things that we talked about. How does the surface determine, what's going on at cytochrome 1? NAD positive induces transcription, probably transcriptional stress of light, and it turns on metabolic genes through the circadian clock. That's really how it works. That means that NAD positive, the aromatic amino acid that it's made out of, is a time crystal. That's actually true. That's tryptophan. BMAL1 is required for chromatin remodeling. Okay. And it uses HSF1, I think. Yeah, HSF1 to recruit NAD positive. So that's what controls the unwinding and dewinding of your nuclear genome. So when that's off, that's another way, because the genome is designed to be quiescent. NAD positive also regulates the light gene in the clock mechanism. That's peer 2. Okay, that controls acetylation. That's the other part of chromatin remodeling. What does that do? It controls feedback repression. You know all this. You know what I'm saying right now is absolutely true. It's in the literature. The listeners of the audience here, they're not going to know this stuff because they're not facile with the science. And here's the last one and the big one. This is the big one. I really dislike David Sinclair, but I have to give him his one due. NAD positive drops, you get pseudo hypoxia. He made the link between NAD and oxygen for longevity. What doesn't he know? NAD positive counterbalances the age-related changes and age decline that occurs in the circadian clock mechanism. That's the real reason. You can't supplement that. And, you probably know when you use NAD analogs, that's been pretty well studied and debunked.
Yeah.
And you know what I'm talking about. This is the reason why I dislike David Sinclair, because he's taken a little bit of science and sold it to lemmings who don't know that much. And there's other people out there that know that all those NAD supplements are absolutely complete bullshit when it comes to longevity. If you want optimal longevity, all you have to do is go to my pinned tweet on Twitter. It's been sitting there for years. It's sunlight. Sunlight is the fastest and best way for you to build back NAD positive. You can use, I guess, time restricted feeding to do it as well, but that's only going to have an ultradian or a circadian effect. It's not going to have a long lasting effect. And it's going to work better in, C. elegans than it does in us. And I think you know that. You even mentioned it in the podcast that you just did. But I want people to understand why, because we are way more complex, metabolically, because we have so many different tissues and so many different functions in us. It doesn't mean that calorie restriction is bad. I'm just going to tell you, calorie restriction is built into how UV light turns off electron chain transport, how it limits ATP production, and how ROS has to be perfectly balanced by water and by melanin endogenously created inside. It turns out the light at nighttime that you make has to be balanced with the light you absorb in the daytime. And this is the reason why when I look on your exterior, I can tell a whole bunch just by the color of your skin and the topology of your retina, and everything else. Everything is related to light.
Well, I was just talking to Max just briefly. I had a podcast with Max, and I was kind of joking, but half interested also about the scientific basis for, let's say, jungle fever, where somebody specifically has like white maternal mitochondrial genes and then black, because also I'm mixed. For anybody who's not watching, I'm mixed. My mom's side is Scandinavian, my dad's side is black, so I tan really easily, but I have these uncoupled mitochondria that are really good at making heat in the winter and have like this ability to be more plastic. So as more people, as our culture becomes more global, there's going to be more and more of this mixing. Are there any implications, positive or negative, for that?
Yeah, for you, I want you, I don't know if you have a boyfriend or you're married, but you need to find somebody that's in the tropics, because you're going to have your ultimate longevity inside the 20s. You think about it. This is the beautiful part. People that have tightly coupled haplotypes, they really cannot stray from their home base far. So that's the reason why, you hear me tell the story about the Somalis or the people from Nairobi. They go to live in Detroit, they get fucking destroyed. And you just think about the story of African Americans. I think you know this.
Yep.
The stroke belt for African Americans is at the 28th to 35th latitude. Why? Believe it or not, when you have black skin, that's a fucking stressor. So you get sicker faster there. But if you have the reverse process, you can actually do really well. Believe it or not, uncoupled haplotypes allow you to be extremely adaptable. Why? Because you're using more of the thermoplastic side of your biochemistry. So temperature changes become extremely important for those people. And your exteriors may get really hot. You may develop melanin, but then what you do is you learn to cool yourself at the same time, and you become like a Tibetan monk. You can become superhuman doing that. And see, that's not something someone who's truly African, say who's from Nairobi at 1 degree north, at 8,000 feet up, those people have purple skin, but they also have L0 haplotypes. This is the reason why they go all over the world and kick people's asses in marathons. But the thing is, if you put that person, say in Mount Fuji in the wintertime, they would fucking die of frostbite really fast because they have no ability to uncouple well, so they would die. They're not adapted to that environment. So someone like you, who, for want of a better term, is a mixed breed, you actually have the best of both worlds. Why? Because you can absorb it fast on the inside. That means your electronic and vibrational levels are always pretty good. But then when you realize that the fat on the bone to really keep you moving is to use CT with that, oh, girlfriend, you're unstoppable. I mean, to be honest with you, you probably would be the ideal woman to have babies with.
Okay.
I'm serious. Because those
I'll put
babies,
that on my resume.
the babies would be getting uncoupled haplotype with excess melanin. And if you think about what I'm trying to do with me as I get older, what am I trying to do? I'm actually trying to become Alexis. Am I not?
That's true.
You don't think about it like that, but I am. And what am I teaching my tribe? I'm teaching the same thing. Am I not?
True.
But see what I'm saying? People don't think about it. Now that you've thought about it, you're like, damn. So there actually is advantages to this, but the thing is, you'll never come to this advantage until you truly understand how light, water, magnetism links, from the surface to the interior.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And maybe one more question, if you have 1 second. I just wanted you talked about methylation earlier, like excess methylation in the brainstem, but I was curious in general about your take on MTHFR and like the quantum biology or the, at that level, what it's doing, like why people get mutations in that, why is it like advantageous in some populations?
Well, it's pretty simple. Most of the functional medicine doctors are robbing people with the mutations. If you have the classic ones in 677 and 12, what is it? 1254? 12, yeah, 1298. That's it. Those tell you that you need more sun, not less. And then you have to worry about it. What's the proof in the pudding? The proof in the pudding is when the two astronauts went up in space, one came back hypermethylated, the other one didn't. They exactly the same thing. What was the difference? One faced huge electromagnetic radiation pollution from the solar wind with no protection in the magnetosphere. The other one didn't. That goes to show you that the genes don't matter. What it does, what did I just tell you about the chromatin remodeling? That's what methylation is doing. Methylation is actually changing metabolic efficiency, inside cells. So it makes it so that NAD positive stays down longer. It means you need more sunlight to reverse it. And it's got to be terrestrial sunlight. When you go in a non-native EMF environment, you're basically creating a hypermethylated state. So hypermethylated state is associated with cancer. It's also associated with obstructive sleep apnea, which gets back to the story I told you before. Anybody who's got obstructive sleep apnea, those are people that tend to have heart disease and have diabetes. It's because they're living in blue light, living around RF and microwaves. It's a light story at its fundamental level. The way for you to reduce it, you go in the sun. What does the sun do effectively? It increases oxygenation in your body. What does oxygen come from? Think about it. You get more venous O2 on that side. So you have higher venous O2 all the time. Do you need to breathe as much when you do that? No. You don't breathe as much. Does your heart beat as much? No. What do we know about longevity? That the less heartbeats you have, the longer you live. So doesn't it hold true why my pin tweet is true and why Peter Attias still remains clueless? Longevity is built around sunlight. It's not built around anything else at all. And you're designed to eat pretty much shit on a shingle if you're in the sun. Okay. When you have alien environments, that's when you have to be really tight what you eat. And it has to be tight to the photosynthetic web of where you live. That's really the story of diet, because there you're trying to control for the electrons and protons, which is through the wiring diagram that we talked about in the beginning of this podcast. And I think people will begin to understand the more UV light you get on your surfaces, the less food you need. That's the basis of the leptin prescription that I wrote 20 years ago. And just because I know all the science doesn't mean I follow my own advice. I'm still taking trauma call. I'm hoping to end that very soon. I've been talking to Chantel about that a lot the last week, and I may decide to end it in the next probably 4 or 5 weeks. Why? Because every time I come here to El Salvador, I feel like a rock star.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That'll be the end of an era. But I mean, you've already done so much good work that it's like kind of time for you to maybe move on to the next chapter, right?
Well, I mean, I think Chantel's going, thank you. Uh, she, let's put it this way. There's an interesting video out there that you may take a gander at. I don't know if you've seen it. It's a young neurosurgeon. He's like 38, 39 years old. He just put it on YouTube. His name is Dr. Gooby. And I think you can find the video. It's Gooby and Doobie. He just posted like 4 or 5 days ago. He's up in the Tetons doing a video where he's getting eaten by mosquitoes, which is also a story about
Mm.
UV light. And he tells a story about how he quit neurosurgery after doing it. He's an MIT trained kid who went to neurosurgery training somewhere. He didn't say where it was. And I would imagine he probably practices somewhere in the Rocky Mountains because of where he was. But he decided after doing neurosurgery for 10 years that he wasn't helping anybody out. And he just quit. And he made some very interesting comments about the people who got better. And the video is like 48 minutes long. But the crazy thing to me is it's got like 3 million views in 4 days. And because this is a doctor telling people the truth, I put my 2 cents in there. I said, yeah, he said really nice things about the other doctors, the people he practiced with in the hospitals. I said, I'm a different kind of cat. I'm a neurosurgeon too, but I decided to do something about this.
Yeah.
And I'm like, I don't want to quit until I've actually done something to change the system. And I'm kind of hoping this guy, now he's got free time on his hands, maybe he comes across a video like this, and I may even say to you, he may be an interesting guy for you to pull on your podcast since he is an absolute newbie.
Sure.
But I think you would find it very interesting what he says in the video because it's two sides of the same coin. Here I am. What drives me is how pissed off I am that I was lied to. And this guy is apologetic, saying, I'm sorry that I think surgery is going to hurt people. Therefore, I'm not going to do it anymore. But that doesn't really fix the system. It just fixed his moral dilemma. Well, I'm not interested in fixing my moral dilemma. I'm actually interested in blowing the system up.
Is there anyone you can pass the torch to?
Anybody who listens to your podcast. I mean, just think about what I told Uberman. Why did I do the Uberman Rick podcast? I told him my interest is not really talking to you, Uberman. I'm interested in talking to the kids you train in medical school.
Yeah.
Well, think about you. You said on the podcast you did with Dr. Gabrielle that, hey, my goal someday is to go back and run my own Rabinowitz lab, except add light to the story. Well, if you do that, and all of a sudden all these biochemists that come out of classic things go, okay, I want to do a fellowship with her and learn the next level. How do we know those aren't going to be the kids that we need to focus in on? How do we know that they're not going to be the ones that pick up this torch and go? I mean, I tell everybody the story. The person who started me down this rabbit hole really probably was Albert St. Georgie, then Becker, then probably Gilbert Ling, then Del Duce, probably Mei Wan Ho. Like all these people kept lighting different parts of me to get me to this place. But all the substrates from my training, like that was the benefit of going through all this training. I know a lot of shit. The problem is I didn't know how, like my residency and neurosurgery never taught me how it all fits together. Like it's crazy to me to think that neurosurgeons come out and they fucking have no earthly idea how the SCN works. They know where it is. They know to avoid it. They know they're scared as shit of the hypothalamus when we do surgery. Why? Because it's known as the big black box. Do not operate in around the hypothalamus. You're going to hurt somebody. But the crazy thing is brain surgery without a scalpel. To me, it's my favorite part of the brain now. Why? Because it's the part that allowed me to figure out all the stuff that you and I talked about. If I didn't know those things, I couldn't have put them all together.
Yeah, it makes sense. And I mean, the brain surgery without a scalpel is very scalable too. And
Well, and
everybody gets access to this
and
information.
that's that's the missing piece that that kid's missing.
Yeah.
Realize that he only had an effect on his local environment of the people that he saw in his practice. When you know this, you can help all kinds of people. And the interesting thing, he does say in the video, he goes, I really wanted to help more people. And he makes the comment that a doctor, when he was in medical school, told him, and it had a huge impact on him, that he goes, my goal to be a doctor is to limit suffering. Well, I got to be honest with you. I think everything that we talked about today is actually about limiting the suffering of chronic disease. And the problem is, we don't limit the suffering of anybody unless we tell all those crazy motherfuckers out there that don't know what they're talking about to shut up
Yep.
because they're wrong. Now, people may not like the way I do it. I'm fine with that, but I'm madder than hell. Like I'm not taking this line down. I'm taking it like y'all just punched me straight in the mouth, and I'm coming back at you. I'm going to let you know just how much you don't know, because there's a lot of way that we have to go in basic science to get just in this little podcast that you and I did. I mean, think about how much people have to put together with biochemistry to understand this. I mean, who would have thought that all the isoforms of EO and nitric oxide synthase have something to do with the ATP production or the stochastics in metabolism? That's an idea that I've never heard from anybody. But guess what? It makes sense. I could never figure out why all the pathways had different levels of ATP. Then I found out they all have different levels of ROS. So I asked the question, why? I mean, that's how this starts. And, if you start your lab and there's kids in there, I guarantee they may get the Nobel Prize and pick up where Sabatini left off and figure out why mTOR really works, what the photo switch for mTOR is. I personally believe I know what it is. But just like anything else, we got to have kids out there to do the basic science to see if my intuitions are right or wrong.
Well, that's the most exciting thing about this entire space is there's so much low-hanging fruit.
I agree. I totally agree with you. And that's why I think you were probably the right person to talk to, and Andrew Huberman was the wrong person to talk to.
Yeah, yeah. He's got a lot of issues. I mean, that was even before we had his whole expose, the hit piece come out, and that was just like a whole other can of worms. But
Yeah, but it makes sense. It fits with the tattoos, and it fits with California.
yeah,
It
low dopamine.
right. It fits with, a lot of different things, and why he's not interested in asking the questions that you clearly were interested in asking me about. That to me says a lot. And, some people want to blame that on you being more inquisitive. I don't. I think that your melanin system, your mitochondria, actually are the reason why it really happened. I think the biophysics are the reason behind that. And I want to surround myself with people that understand that the biophysics is the tribe. I believe how they vibe and your tribe go together. I want to be around people that resonate, with this kind of stuff. Doesn't mean that I think all the biochemistry guys are low agency. I just think that they don't know what they don't know. And when they hear something like this, they're going to go, damn, I never thought about this. I never actually looked at it this way. That may be all it takes.
Yeah, and that's another reason why food isn't one of the pillars because, I mean, the food that you're drawn to eat or your cravings and your appetite, that's all driven by deeper levels of the light water magnetism level of reality. So it's just a second order phenomenon.
Yeah, I think that's what cravings are about. I think they're biophysical cravings that you're
Yeah.
missing certain, frequencies and species of light.
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised about that at all. I want to be mindful of your time, but I mean, it's July 14th right now. There was a quite big event yesterday. You have anything you want to say about it before we sign off?
Uh, well, it kind of depends. I would tell you that I told you before we started this that I made the prediction that this was going to happen. I think our country's in a really bad spot. I do fundamentally believe that health and wealth are fundamentally linked. Um, I think that centralized science has been ruined by one particular party for a long time. We're not talking about a short time, a really long time. And that party will probably surprise some people here. It's not the DNC or the RNC, it's the Uniparty. It's both parties that have this idea that they need to control everything in our life. And what my belief is that we need constitutional freedoms. They need to understand we don't have a democracy. It's a constitutional republic. And the founding fathers wrote that constitution to limit the power of the government. Right now, to me, the government is too big. And I look at a guy like Trump, even though I don't like him, my cup of tea right now is Bobby Kennedy. The reason why is because he's for medical freedoms and he's for Bitcoin. I'm a 2-issue voter right now. And I believe Bobby understands that the chronic disease epidemic, and his vice president understands that as well. I think they're more likely to do something about this. Trump is now talking about Bitcoin. He's also talking about the chronic disease issue, but I think that's more about getting votes. But the truth be told, I think we, the people, may have lost more than you want to know from that 20-year-old, because I really thought Bobby had a big chance of winning. I think his chances went down with what happened yesterday. I think Trump is going to win. And I understand people are really upset, how this all went down. And they should be. Anybody who isn't upset, because this really is an attack on we, the people. And I almost hate to say this because I think it'll come off wrong, but I don't care what other people think. I just want you to know how I feel. That image of him getting shot and standing up with blood on his face and putting his hand up. You can say a lot of things about the guy, but he's fighting for what he believes in. And maybe he can get the stuff right on medical freedoms. Maybe he can go against Big Pharma. I mean, certainly he's been screwed by Fauci and, the centralized science guys. He's starting to sound like he understands the banks are a big problem. So maybe it's the case. I don't know. But the one thing I do know is what happened yesterday. The big message to all of us: we can't stay for the status quo. And the status quo in Washington, D.C. has to change. And I think, what you and I have talked about in 2 podcasts, I've said to you very clearly, I think the status quo in centralized science needs to change. I think you have probably a much better idea now why I fundamentally believe that. But I do think what happened yesterday and what happened in science, they're linked. They're very entangled. And I believe voting matters, and I believe we need to vote just about every incumbent out. And we need new blood. The patient is in the ICU and sick as shit, and we need to get rid of the cancer that's all around us. And it's everywhere. It's in the media, it's in corporations, it's in science, and maybe in some of your friends. I've seen some of the tweets and things on Twitter today that just like turn my stomach, and I look at some of the stuff going on in culture, like the cultural war, which is really when this civil war began. People think the Civil War began yesterday at 6:11 p.m. I don't think it did. I think it began really when they killed JFK. And I think it really started there. And that's when culture started to fall apart and ideology started to fall apart. And we've become less American every day. And when I mean less American, it doesn't mean white Anglo-Saxon American. What it means is we don't respect life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness like we used to. And I think freedoms matter. And when you take people's freedom to be healthy away, when you take their money away, you are doing some really nefarious things to people. And we have to stop it. Don't quit. Don't give up. And as much as it pains me to say, because I was planning on voting and still plan on voting for Bobby Kennedy, I think what we saw on the stage yesterday, that will be an image that goes down in history. That's going to be hard not to see. And I think people are mad about it.
Yeah, I've definitely seen that response as well. And I mean, from like the personal responsibility standpoint, it really goes back to everything we talked about on the past 2 podcasts, where you need to start with yourself and your health in order to even have the ability to critically think and make good decisions around higher order, your household, your community, your state, your country. It's like we need to really focus at home first on ourselves, and then, you know, we can expand out from there. But yeah, I think ultimately we each have the responsibility to do that. And once we do that, I mean, I do see a lot of people already waking up to the major issues that we're facing societally and at a personal level. And once you can take positive steps to reconnect with nature and the sun and rebuild your dopamine and start to be able to think more clearly, see more clearly, that life can change in a really radical way pretty quickly.
You're not kidding. Where he got shot, literally, I'm a brain surgeon. If they would have hit him in the jugular foramen, that's a kill shot. It's just like if you get shot in your femoral artery, and I don't expect people to know that, but I know that. And I'm literally telling you, you're a millimeter or two away. It doesn't even have to go into the brain. All it would have to do is break the bone right behind the ear, and you're done. You'll bleed to death immediately. It's a devastating place to get shot. And the crazy part of the story I heard today, I didn't know this until before we did the podcast, is that a cop went up, saw the guy, and that's why he rushed the shot.
Wow.
It's like so crazy that you almost feel like there had to be some divine intervention, where nature is actually looking out for us and saying, look, there's a lot of bad mojo here, but now it's up to us to decide what we have to do. And I think each one of us will have to process this information differently, kind of just like I told you about processing some of the science that I brought to you today. You say, yeah,
Yes.
I got to think about this. I think it's the same thing with politics, but I do think that I hope that people aren't afraid to do podcasts and talk about this, even if we're talking about science, because I'm a firm believer that health and wealth are fundamentally linked at a very, very critical level. And I just want people to have self-sovereignty in both. That's really what I care about the most, because I think you can't be a good patient and you can't be a good steward of the environment if you don't have ultimate freedom to move through that environment.
100%. And you'll be happy to know I've been buying Bitcoin every week for a while now. I'm full on.
That means that the Light Rabinowitz lab is possible.
Yeah, it is. It is. I'm really excited about it. I'm only going to do it if I can do it the right way, though, you know? So it might
I
take
hear you.
some time, but it's worth it.
All right.
It's worth
Sounds
it.
good.
This was really fun. You're the best. I'm going to post this tonight, so it'll be up.
Oh,
And
really?
yeah, I'm just going to post it right away because we're talked about current events and stuff at the end, especially. So we'll just get it out. And yeah, I'll tag you and you can post if you want on your page as well. And
Okay.
yeah, thank you so much for your time. You're so
All right.
generous as
Take
always.
care.
You too.
Bye-bye.